At some point in the 1600s, a man on Easter Island tried to build a canoe. He knew what a canoe was. He had seen them. His grandfather had described them in detail. The curved hull, the depth of the hull, the way the outrigger balanced the whole thing in open water. He just didn't know how to make one. Not because he was unintelligent, not because the knowledge had been hidden from him, but because the last person who actually knew how to build one had died before he was born. And that person had learned from someone who died before them. And somewhere in that chain, the knowledge had simply stopped being passed down. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the people of Easter Island had been cut off from the rest of the Pacific for over 3 centuries. They had no ocean-going vessels of any kind. A civilization that had crossed 2,000 miles of open ocean to settle one of the most remote islands on Earth had completely forgotten how to sail. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. And it is one of the most disturbing things ever documented about the fragility of human knowledge. Easter Island sits in the southeastern Pacific, 2,300 miles from the coast of Chile. The nearest inhabited island is 1,300 miles away. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived, somewhere between 700 and 1200 AD, they brought with them a complete civilization, tools, agricultural knowledge, a social structure, a religious system, and the ability to build the vessels that had carried them there. At its peak, the island supported somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 people. They quarried and erected 900 massive stone statues. The moai, some weighing 80 tons. They had a writing system called rongo-rongo, the only writing system ever independently developed in all of Oceania. They had a functioning, complex society. Then it came apart. The story most people know blames deforestation. The islanders cut down all their trees to move the statues, the theory goes. And without trees, they couldn't build canoes, couldn't fish offshore, and the whole system collapsed. It's a clean parable about environmental destruction. It gets taught in schools. It is also mostly wrong. Or rather, it is a symptom, not the cause. The more researchers have studied Easter Island, the more the collapse looks less like an environmental disaster and more like a systems failure, a civilization that had built itself on interlocking dependencies, each one essential, none of them visible until it was already gone. Here is what actually happened. The first thing to understand is what the trees were actually doing. The palm forests that once covered the island weren't just raw material for moving statues. They were the substrate of the entire economy. Their roots held soil together. Their canopy created microclimates that allowed agriculture to work. Their wood-fueled cooking fires preserved food, built homes. The forests weren't a resource the islanders were consuming. They were the system that made everything else possible. When the forests thinned, through a combination of land clearing, rat infestations that ate the seeds, and yes, logging for statue transport, the effects didn't appear immediately. They appeared slowly, then everywhere at once. Soil eroded, crop yields dropped. The fishing boats that required specific curved timber couldn't be replaced when they wore out. The specialized knowledge of how to build them was held by a small number of people. When those people died before passing it on, the knowledge died with them. And here is the part that should unsettle you. None of the people making these decisions thought they were dismantling their civilization. They were doing what people do, farming their land, honoring their religion, building monuments that signaled status and power, competing with rival clans, making rational short-term decisions that collectively produced an irrational long-term outcome. They were not stupid, they were not reckless, they were just human beings, operating without a view of the whole system, because no individual human being ever has a view of the whole system. By the 1600s, the population had collapsed from its peak to somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 people. The moai building had stopped entirely, not because the people stopped wanting to build them, but because the supply chains that made building them possible had disintegrated. The quarries still held half-finished statues. They were abandoned mid-carve. The rongo-rongo writing system disappeared, not destroyed, forgotten. The number of people who could read it had fallen below whatever threshold was needed for the knowledge to survive. When the last fluent readers died, they took it with them. We still cannot read it today. And then, there was the canoe. Polynesian navigation is one of the most sophisticated bodies of knowledge ever developed without instruments. Wayfinders could read ocean swells, star positions, bird flight patterns, and cloud formations to navigate thousands of miles with no landmarks in sight. It took years to learn. It required constant practice. It was transmitted person to person, apprentice to master, over generations. On Easter Island, as the population dropped and the social structures that supported specialist knowledge broke down, the chain broke. The master died. The apprentice died before training anyone. The next generation learned fragments, then less than fragments, then nothing. By the time outsiders arrived, the people of Easter Island were marooned, not by geography, by forgetting. This is the part that changes how you think about civilization. We tend to assume that knowledge, once acquired, is permanent, that it exists somewhere, in books, in culture, in the structure of language, and can always be recovered. But Easter Island demonstrates something colder. Knowledge doesn't live in objects. It doesn't live in writing. It lives in people, in the specific chain of transmission, from one person to the next. And when that chain breaks, the knowledge doesn't go dormant. It dies. The moai are still there. You can see them. But you cannot ask them how they were moved because the people who knew are gone, and the methods they used have been the subject of academic debate for over a century. A civilization left behind its largest monuments and forgot how to make them within a few generations. Now, here is the uncomfortable part. Modern civilization is more complex than Easter Island by several orders of magnitude. The systems we depend on, food production, energy, medicine, clean water, communication, are not understood in their entirety by any single person alive. They are distributed across millions of specialists, each holding a small piece of an incomprehensibly large whole. Most people in developed countries cannot grow their own food, cannot purify their own water, cannot generate their own heat, cannot manufacture the medicines they depend on to stay alive. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how complexity works. Specialization creates efficiency. Interdependence creates capability that no individual or small group could replicate. That is how you get smartphones and surgery and supply chains that can deliver anything anywhere. But it is also how you get fragility. The Easter Islanders were not uniquely vulnerable. They were not a warning about some primitive failure mode that modern civilization has evolved beyond. They were doing exactly what every successful civilization does, building layered systems of dependency that collectively produce outcomes no one person could achieve alone. The difference between them and us is not the structure, it is the scale. Their system could fail locally and completely. Ours is large enough that local failures get absorbed, but large-scale failures, the kind that cascade across interdependencies faster than anyone can respond, are something no civilization has ever survived. We have never tested what happens when the chain breaks at scale. We are reasonably confident it won't. The people of Easter Island were reasonably confident too. They looked at the moai standing on the hillsides, at the crops in the fields, at the boats on the water, and they saw a civilization that had mastered its environment. They had no reason to think that within a few generations, their descendants would stand on the same shore, staring at the same ocean, with no idea how to cross it. The knowledge was there once. Then, it wasn't, and they didn't even know what they'd lost, until they needed it.